Hello everyone, today I'm going to let you behind the veil a bit and tell you about a couple of secret things being worked on. Well, they're not really secret, they won't be secret after this goes out. So I'm working on a variety of things, and Ben and I are also working on one thing. I say working, it's only like whenever we get a free moment. First of all, crystal generation. So me and Ben really like minerals and crystals and stuff like that. Ben wanted to have a go at kind of generating them in geometry nodes and creating interesting materials. So that's one thing that we're both kind of having our hand at. And also for me especially, how to light things like mineral and crystalline structures. I have a very specific idea that's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're doing, that involves photogrammetrizing real life minerals and then blending the geometry of those in specific ways to get hyper realistic minerals in Blender. By the way, if you hear weird noises in the background, I'm also running a 3D print at the moment for a different project. But anyway, I'm just letting you know that we are experimenting at the moment. And the way our kind of creative dynamic works is that Ben will produce something in his own type of file, like with geonodes, with materials. He likes to work a lot with oranges when it comes to materials. So for example, like his files may look a bit like this, and you may actually see on like social posts, he may be putting out like little previews every now and again. And then he sends them to me, I put them into my own world, and then I use them as like lighting tests, and I modify the material to add a bit more detail, things like certain roughness, scratches, some like gradation between like lower, higher areas, how does light scatter through, etc. So we don't know exactly about like an end product or a level of complexity for like sharing this with people. I think in Ben's mind he wants to do something not too big or complex, whereas while I'm playing with it, I'm, like I said, thinking about, well, separately, maybe for a different project, how do I want to make hyper realistic things. So if something does become available to you, it will likely be a relatively simple crystalline generator that may be useful for like a wide range of projects, but maybe something that's not too scientifically accurate. But we'll see how it goes. I'm just letting you know that that's something that we're working on. Actually, what we're looking at here is a really simple version. Ben has actually sent me slightly more updated files with more geometry nodes controls. It is quite fun playing with like gradation in colors and stuff. So regardless of what happens, if we do put something out, you can be assured that it will be fun to play with and have quite a bit of artistic control, as you can see. The crystalline things are actually surprisingly difficult to light. This actually gives me some lessons to learn for my own afterglow work, because crystalline materials, they're basically reflecting light from like every direction. So they require very specific types of setups. In fact, as you can see, I mean, I've got, what's happening here? Ben had a spotlight with a kind of gobo type texture on it, which is a dappling, shadowy light. I have one of my kind of emissive lights from Afterglow, which if I show in the very visibility there, so it's kind of circular. And, you know, rotating that around, it's quite apparent how subtle changes in the lighting can have rather drastic influences on the object. So you can start to see, I was going to point at the screen, but you can't see where I'm pointing while I'm rotating. But if you look along like the boundary of the mesh there, the exact positions of where highlights are and the thickness of the highlights changes quickly. Shadow areas down here, they can quickly present color or just darkness depending on where the light is. So they're quite tricky, but it teaches me about what kinds of templates I want to add to Afterglow in the future for like lighting products. Also having things down on the ground level here. I know that for Afterglow I want to do ground level presets because a lot of the Studio Cage ones are like suspended in midair, which is fine. It depends on the kind of thing you want to make. But from looking at what people have been making with the product so far, it reminds me, okay, well, ground level stuff is something that a lot of people will want to use and be in demand going into the future. So that was a joint project. This one is a personal project. So I've also been working on a pack of container pieces that I'm intending to be modular, but we'll see how that goes. I spoke briefly about it on my second channel not that long ago, but a little bit extra has been done since then. So the reason for this is because I love container homes. I love the concept of them, and I haven't done like an asset pack for a while. Actually, I don't know if I've ever done like a proper asset pack for the Blender community. I've done a variety of resources, but the intention is to give you a pack of easily constructible pieces to build container homes, which in my mind will be good for people doing like everyday artworks. You know, people like Stupid Giant, he's one of my favorite, because I know people like that love this kind of stuff. Easily constructible, building some shanty environments. I was also playing around with like using my ambient grunge on assets like this, and you can see how quickly you can build up some faux level of complexity without needing any like texturing skill involved. I've also been building like modular I-beam sections which work on the regular grid as well, of different lengths, with the idea being that you'll be able to kind of build frames around it. And yeah, so some of it is kind of partially rigged as well. I say rigged like in quotes, the origin points are kind of set up to allow you to have like container doors open and close. They're relatively complex things to model, container doors. There's lots of different types of them, but I've tried to get like a suitable level of detail that's kind of semi-realistic, even down to like the like rubber sections there. They won't necessarily be textured. I've been thinking about that. I talked about it on the second channel, whether to have textures, because I'm aiming for like Blender art, not necessarily game art, but I do want to make them game developer friendly. And with that in mind, maybe I'll UV map them, but not texture them. It depends. My approach for completing a pack like this is to first of all build a proof case, as I call it, which is a combination between a proof of concept and a use case. What that means is building something pretty, like an actual environment with a container home. And when I'm happy with that, it gives me an idea for what I actually need to go from nothing to a pretty scene like that. And then of the pieces I make, in achieving that proof case, I will break them down into the pieces which become effectively the asset library. And you can see that the asset library is being built here at the moment. So this is kind of like the first step in building a proof case. I mean, I've got quite far with it so far, but ideally I'd like it to be a bit prettier with some, more details, more constructive elements. I need to modularize things like the railings, because as you can see, I've been doing the I-beams, but the railings need to be done. Additionally, the containers, this is actually built on like, I think 20-foot containers. So the bog standard container like collection asset, which I've just dragged in here, is a standard size for a shipping container, even though they come in different sizes. As you can see, it's again modeled to a fine enough detail for like most artistic use cases. But because the actual size of the shipping container is not completely compatible with the standard Blender grid, I was trying to think of ways to make it easier to snap them together. Interestingly, one thing I came up with was this sort of like ghost grid system. I don't know if I'll go anywhere further with this, but say for example, you have this and the inner section represents a container. If I duplicate this grid thing and then move it along, or maybe even move it upwards, it's only going to work up to a certain layer. If I then drag in a container asset, you'll notice that the origin point is actually kind of in the bottom left corner of the container. If I select this first ghost grid and then Shift S, cursor to selected, click on the container, and then Shift S up, selection to cursor, it puts it in that part of the grid. I can delete the grid. But then you'll notice that to get the container snapping perfectly above, it doesn't really fit on the grid properly. But this upper ghost grid object, as you may notice, has some of these like extending vertices hovering in thin air. So if I go into edit mode, select the one at the appropriate corner of the container asset, then Shift S, cursor to selected, then duplicate the container asset, and then selection to cursor, it puts it exactly where it should be. So the ghost grid is kind of like a guide of vertex points. There's one where it only extends like one layer, and another one here it's extending multiple layers. And from there you can use those vertex points as like anchors to put the 3D cursor to give you like an easy way to find the snapping points. Also on the collection asset, if you need it, I've put like an empty object in the top corner as well. So if you like realized the instances by making instances real, you can grab that and use that as your 3D cursor anchor point. So I'm thinking about ways to kind of make it easy to use it modularly like that. But again, given the slightly odd dimensions in a metric space, it's a little bit complicated. The I-beams are much easier because I've done them on a metric system. I'm working on different junctions for how they connect together. As for the lengths, they are standard metric as well, so 1 meter, 2 meter, 3 meter, etc. But then I have the container length. So these ones are again a bit off grid, but they do fit together. So I've got a bit of a combination there. One thing I like about this, as I kind of visually alluded to earlier by sitting in this corner, is container home things like this, they're very pretty for building up like lighting scenes. Let me just brighten this up a bit. Because if you have sections with like large window spaces like that, they're like fantastic quick starting points for interior design. They look very pretty. And also if I rotate the sun around, you can see how like the shadowing changes in here as well. So it's actually really fun to play around with these, I'm finding. I don't know how big the pack will be when it gets done, or how much it'll be in terms of like a price tag, but it will likely be governed by the studio-friendly license as well, like my other products. And yeah, I just think it'll be a fun thing for people that want to like quickly build up structural assets and stuff. But yeah, so those are like two things that are just in the pipeline. Again, what I'll always say with these things is, for things that are in development, maintain your expectations. Projects can change at any point. I've often worked on things in the past like sculpt materials that didn't get released, but that kind of turned into something else. Like my old procedural sculpt materials became hex scatter in the future. Because what I realized while making these semi-procedural sculpting visuals was that we really needed a better system for scattering non-seamless textures. And the solutions that other people had made in the community, I didn't really like that much, or there were still things missing. That's why I commissioned Azzy to create the perfect node. Actually, speaking about that, let me just show you something about hex scatter that it occurred to me I probably hadn't mentioned, or rather that I might have forgotten to mention. So I noticed this thing in Blender 4.4. I think it's been there for a while. It's not a problem in the main file. This looks fantastic, by the way. If you haven't picked up hex scatter, please do. By the time this video goes out, there might be a spring sale active on Superhive and or Gumroad. I'm not too sure about that, but just check it. This might be a good opportunity to grab things. Let me go to a new file. There's just something I want to demonstrate. So I'm in my startup file, also available on Gumroad. Sorry, I know I'm shilling a lot of my own things, but this is what I do. I've come to realize my identity. I make things, I sell things. If you've got a problem with that, then I'm sorry. I just love making resources and tools. There will be more free stuff in the future as well. I can promise you that, but there is already a lot of free stuff available. You might want to check out the community material pack on Gumroad. That's a popular one. Collection of free materials there. So I'm in my regular startup file, cursor to selected on this center point. Let me make a cube, give it a subdivision of 5, for example. Make sure it's shaded flat in this case as a demonstration. Now I'm going to make a material for this and bring in TP hex splat material node, and let's plug in the color, the roughness, and the normal. And I'm going to turn the global scale down. I'll also set up displacement while we're here. Let me apply that subdivision, add a new subdivision surface with adaptive, go to the material, under settings, make sure displacement is set to displacement and bump. Then I'm going to add a displacement node, plug the height into there, plug the displacement into the displacement output, then hold shift. I'm going to turn the scale down a bit. Right, so there's one thing I just want to make some people aware of when using hex scatter. Obviously, the point of hex scatter is to make non-seamless materials seamless without any seams by definition, obviously. So if I turn down the cell blending and the triplanar blending, you can see these seam lines here. Now let me just remove the second subdivision. What you might notice is if I turn up the cell blending and then the triplanar blending, that, hold on, what's going on here? Why is it not blending? That's weird. That's a problem. We don't want that. Curtis, you promised us that there would be no seams. What is happening and why are they primarily isolated here along where the triplanar should be working? I'm turning this up. It's not great. I just want to let you know for hex scatter users that may have encountered this issue, right click, shade smooth, and the problem is gone. So that's in part because when you're shading smooth, you're applying like normal data that's then used in the calculation process of the node groups for creating that blending. So you may have encountered situations where the blending isn't working correctly. I just want to let you know about that you may need to provide this smooth normal data to the object, and that then completes the required data that's needed for hex scatter to like fully function, if you want to think about it that way. So this wasn't like a big enough issue to do like a dedicated video about, but I figured that since, you know, you're here and we're talking about like work in progress things, if you've ever bumped into that problem, just shade your object smooth. And it's kind of fine because the kind of materials you're going to be using with hex scatter are organic type materials anyway, not structural ones. So it makes sense that you'd be shading smooth the objects anyway. So yeah, if you made it this far through the video, put some kind of, well, either a rock or a crystalline or like a crane emoji, because we're talking about like minerals and container homes. Put that in the comments so I can see if you made it this far. Again, there might be a sale running at the moment. If you're watching this in the future, then probably not. But if you're early, then just double check. You can otherwise support me on Patreon. There's actually a very early version of that container asset project on my Patreon for $5 members and above. It's not a complete or up-to-date version, but it is like an experimental, like earlier file. Otherwise, you can just support me if you want to and check out my other resources on curtisholt.online/store. So have a fantastic day, everyone. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.